Hey everybody, my name is Mike Montgomery, and today I'm going to show you how to install luxury vinyl plank flooring.
We're going to be going over the old hardwoods, subfloor with an LVP underlayment, even tiles in the bathroom, and we're doing it all seamless with no transitions.
And I want them centered right here in the middle of this hallway. I measured to find the middle of the hallway, and then I put a nail at the far end. Then I grabbed a chalk line and I went all the way to the other side of the house where I could snap that line as my reference point. Then I measured the distance off of that line to the wall that I want to start on. I measure that number by the width of the face of each plank, not including the tongue and groove, and that'll tell me how many planks plus how much extra I'll need to reach the wall. It's also very helpful to lay out your boards to visualize all of this math and to double check you did it right if you're not a genius like me. I don't know if that came off right. I'm trying to say I'm not a genius. I laid out my boards though, and the math was confirmed. I would be left with just a little sliver to cover the gap between that last full plank and the wall. So instead of centering my middle board in the middle of the hallway, I'm centering the seam between those two boards. This gives me about half of a plank's width from the edge of the last one to the wall. And for me, that was really easy to cut with my table saw.
You can also cut LVP with a circular saw or a jigsaw. Just use a straight edge.
As you can see, I'm starting at the front door, so I'm not going to put this board right in the corner where it stops in the doorway. I'm going to make sure it goes past it on both sides. That way, I can use a spacer against the drywall.
It's very helpful if when you cut these pieces, they're uniform. The table saw is really easy for this, but like I mentioned, using a straight edge with a circular saw or a jigsaw can help you get uniform results.
I'm just going to scoot this down a little bit. That way I can use this full piece. And I'm going to make sure that we're 1/4 of an inch off of this wall also.
I used a lot of spacers on this first wall because I want it to be well supported. I'm going to be using my tapping block and mallet against these planks to get the next rows seated.
This really is one of the coolest aspects of working with luxury vinyl is you can cut it with a razor blade. Just make sure that you score it really well with a good amount of downward pressure. That way you don't have to score it twice. Then you can just take it to an edge and snap it like that. Super pro.
I could have used my utility knife for the second cut, but for the sake of getting the same size piece, I used my table saw, and once again, made sure to throw in quite a few spacers.
Now I don't have an off piece from that end because I ended the row with a full piece. And I can't just put another full piece down because my seams are way too close together. It's important that there's at least 8 to 10 inches between seams, and I don't have that. So I'll just cut this down about 10 inches to size.
And FYI, I'm using a 1/4 inch spacer.
Now we can start laying down our first row of full width pieces. Let's go. Whenever I do this, first I like to make sure that my tongue and groove are locked in, and I'm gonna support right here to make sure they stay connected.
To secure my pieces together, I'm going to be using a tool called a tapping block along with a hammer or a rubber mallet, which is preferred. This will help me join the planks together for a watertight seal.
At the end of this run, I'm just going to take my next board, flip it to where it's upside down. Then I'll make a mark right here where I want to cut it. I'll score it with my razor blade and straight edge, and then just snap it. And then this is where the pull bar comes in handy. Perfect.
For these first few rows, I'm going to only be using the tapping block on the ends of the planks, not on the edges, which I should be, just to show you what could go wrong if you do the same.
Remember, however your plank is going to set, reverse it before you mark and cut it.
In general, it's best to only score your plank one time with your razor blade before you break it. That way you make sure you get a clean snap. But if you use a speed square like me, not only will you get square ends, you can also go back over the same line that you've already scored if you need to make that a deeper groove. Currently, I've got 6 boxes open, that way I get a good mix of planks, and I'm using the Modin line from a company called Flooret, which is a really cool direct-to-consumer flooring company. They send samples to your house, that way you can see the colors in real life, and I like the Tilden line. It's a light gray wash with some subtle wood tones still coming through. I'll share links to the floors I used, along with all of the other tools, materials, and supplies that you'll need for this project. There's also a code for 50% off your own sample pack if you want to check them out.
So far in this install, I haven't been using my tapping block to hit the floor along the edge here. Now you want to do that to make sure it's seated in there and it creates a good watertight bond, but it also prevents another issue that I wanted to show you. On the side of the floor where we started, the spacers are really locked in there. You can't wiggle them loose. But on the right side of the floor, you can see that they come up way too easy. There's about a 1/16 of an inch gap. And that makes sense if you think about how we're constantly putting pressure on that end to smush all the ends together. This whole slab of floor is just trying to pivot that way. If you've made this same mistake, here's how to fix it. Start by tapping the whole edge of your floor slab all the way down, starting from the side that you're typically laying floor. This may expose the gap on the ends of a couple boards. That's no problem because we're gonna go down the entire right side of the slab and use our pull bar to knock all of our boards back together. That's also one benefit of seeing the lines in the hardwood floor. I can see now how much better everything's aligned.
That was just a quick demonstration, and I hope it helped. From now on, you're going to see me using the tapping block along the end and the edge of each plank. If you've got a really sharp utility knife, it's even possible to cut about a 3/4 inch piece off of the end of a plank. Just use the edge of a workbench or plywood.
And this is why I totally don't recommend one of those expensive vinyl cutters. And remember, a jigsaw, a circular saw, a miter saw, a table saw, and I'm sure other things that I'm not even remembering can cut vinyl floors, so save your money.
If you're using a rubber mallet, use the hard side. It'll make your life a lot easier. Don't hit your planks too hard though, really only a 3, maybe a 4 out of 10.
I also see a lot of people score these and then break them over their knee. Now that works really well, but you can see where it didn't break here at the end. Instead, I recommend doing what I've been showing, which is put your board upside down, place your hand right next to where you know the break is gonna be, and then just pull up. And for short pieces, again, just go to the edge of a board or a work table.
It didn't take long for me to find out that it was really helpful to have my stack of boards right next to me while I was installing. That way I could see all of my patterns and make sure that I wasn't putting down any duplicates too close to one another.
This right here is another potential mistake that you want to avoid. The pattern on this board and this one right here are the exact same. I was just quickly using this offcut because it was a convenient length rather than paying attention to the pattern in this moment. So always be diligent.
Really, it wasn't a big problem because I just cut a new piece to the same size and I kept that piece because I'm sure it can get used somewhere else. And now we're at the transition between the hardwoods and the kitchen subfloor.
I just did a dry run of boards over the transition between the hardwood floors and the underlayment that's over the plywood subfloors. I want to make sure everything sits flat, and visually it looks great. But when I walk over the seam, I can tell that there's a little bit of a bump in the existing hardwood floors. It's a tiny bit low right here. It's a little bit high right here. You can see whenever I use a straight edge, there's a bump or a hump here in the hardwood floor. It levels itself out here at the end and down by the concrete, which is good. I'm gonna use this electric hand planer to level out all of the raised section just right here. I honestly thought I had everything ready to go, but I'm glad this happened. That way, if any of y'all experience something like this, you know what to do. I don't want to take too much at a time. I'm actually going to start with just a little more than a 32nd of an inch.
You can tell that these planer blades have seen better days. That's just because I had already gone through some nails that were securing the hardwood floors down. It was still able to get the job done though.
Wow, that's way better already. Still a tiny bit high in the middle, but we're about 60%, 75% of the way there.
This planer was killer. It worked both on the hardwoods and this little bit of concrete that I used to fix a low spot to the left in the previous episode that I've mentioned before.
Yes. And next, I'm gonna fix this board right here and just a little bit of a low spot that follows the wall.
I'm using a product you guys have seen me use many times. It's called Henry Feather Finish. And basically, it's a concrete product that's made to bond to any type of subfloor to level out before you put down new flooring. It's literally made for this.
So the low spot is the corner, and you'll see me radiate out from it.
I chose to use a small trowel, but even this gave me enough reference surface to float this concrete and do all of this by feel and eye. I wanted to make sure that it wasn't any higher than the underlayment to the right of these floors. And after I gave everything time to dry, I came back to chisel down any high points, and I also used my random orbit sander with 80 grit sandpaper to smooth everything out. During this repair, I used painter's tape on the edge of my floor to make sure I didn't get any dust underneath. After I took all of that off, it was time to get back to installing. I had already laid these pieces down once, so it was really quick to put them back down.
We've made it to the other side of the living room, and now we've got to fill this space in between the wall, and we've got to work around the wall itself. To get my seams lined up how I want, I'm starting with this off piece, and I'm going to rip it to width. It's not going to be very wide, but I'll use my utility knife by scoring it along the length, and then using the edge of the plywood as a brace when I snap it.
To measure the piece I'm going to cut next, I put it down in the same orientation it'll be installed, and I measured 1/4 inch off of the wall, both from the end and the mating edge. I'll cut this section away using a jigsaw and a high tooth count blade. Always do your best to follow the line when you're cutting, but remember, you'll have baseboard trim to cover this, so it does not need to be perfect.
Perfect. Nailed it.
The seam of the 2 floors underneath my planks was closer than I wanted to the edge of this row. There's still about a 1/2 or 3/4 inch overlap, which is workable, but it would be awesome if that seam was in the middle of a plank. You'll notice that I marked and cut this piece using the same method as I did on the right side of the room, and it worked really well. I was able to use my pull bar to wedge my pieces together. I had boxes of flooring stashed throughout the house, and from here on out, I had 8 boxes open at any one point. In some boxes, you could have more dark or heavy grain, while in others, you could have planks that have lighter colors and lighter grain. And you want to be sure and mix them up. To get around the other side of this dividing wall, I didn't need to cut away very much from the next board. It is important though that you always incorporate the 1/4 inch gap off of the wall whenever you're measuring and marking. That way, you end up getting a cut that you like. I was really happy that these planks went over the transition smoothly, and when I walked over them, it felt flat because this is what I was most nervous about in the whole project.
This is where I'm calling it quits today. We've made good progress, and tomorrow I'll start working down the hallway into the dining room and the kitchen. So stay tuned.
And first, I wanted to see how close I was going to be to the true center of this hallway.
Nice. And check that out. We are right on the chalk line. Now I want to make sure that this board is in line and straight with the rest. So I'm going to use this 4-foot straight edge, and I'm going to make sure that it's flat against this piece and just make a match. And this is just a piece of scrap. I'm going to use it as a stop and just screw it in place. We're making really good progress. We're at a great milestone. I'm going to go ahead and start my next row. That way I can use these pieces to help measure and mark all of the custom boards that I've got to cut around the doorways in the hall.
And using these full width planks will help keep the smaller ones from deflecting as easy.
And now I'm going to measure from the edge of my board to the chalk line, and it's just about 11 3/4. So I want to match that on the end. We'll move it to about right there. So we'll throw some spacers behind it. And now it's time to cut around this doorway.
Whenever you're marking pieces that are going to go in a doorway, you want to make sure that they've got enough material to slide underneath the door jamb about 1/2 inch.
Okay, here we go.
Just make sure those ends get connected well.
Awesome. And I ended up getting really lucky because on the other side here is about 1/4 inch off the wall, exactly where I want to start my next row. That wasn't on purpose, but I'm hyped. And now what I'm going to do is make sure we're still at 11 3/4 and make it match down here. Oh, that's perfect.
The next plank is going to be a little bit of a tricky one because it goes through this divider between 2 doorways. It's got a really thin strip of material connecting 2 bigger chunks, and it's going to be tough knocking it into place without breaking.
All right, now this one's going to have to kind of slide in. There we go. I don't have a ton of material here, so I'm being really careful when I tap.
With that connection successful, I put in my next plank and then measured off of the line.
11 3/4 right there. Then that makes our gap here perfect too.
The final piece in this row was easy compared to the others. I was able to use my pull bar and get a good connection. After I confirmed the correct offset, I screwed down some support blocks to make sure nothing shifted. And then I could start running the rest of the rows down the hallway. And I've got to say, it was really cool going down the chalk line and seeing the edges of my board just line up right where they were supposed to.
And we're dead on. That is freaking awesome. Super pro.
The rest of this hallway install was pretty straightforward because I don't want to work through the doorways into each of the rooms yet. I basically want to continue in the dining room and kitchen area and wrap all of that up before I move on.
All right, remember, you want to flip your board, leave a little bit of a gap, Mark where you want to cut it.
Then score it with a utility knife and a speed square for a clean break. And also, really quick in this video, I'd like to give a big shout out to knee pads. If you're going to take on a project like this, make sure and get some decent ones that aren't going to slide around on you.
And now it's time to cut our custom piece leading into the hallway. To mark this piece, we'll start in the correct orientation, and I'll mark about a 1/4 inch offset from the wall. Then I'll carry that line across with my speed square. And here I've got just a little more than 1.5 inches to my face, and it's about the exact same down here. And now I'll make sure and measure off of the mating edge, and I'll incorporate that 1/4 inch gap.
I connected those dots with a straight edge and then cut it out with a jigsaw. I've seen quite a few TikToks with tricky ways to measure your boards, but honestly, if you're decent with a tape measure, it doesn't take long to lay out lines, like I said, especially with a speed square.
Looks more like a 3/8 inch gap than a 1/4, but this will be okay. I'm pausing right here on the hallway. I'm gonna finish that side of the house after I get this side complete. And really quick, before we move on, I'd like to give a big thanks to the sponsor of today's episode, Squarespace. Now, with Fluid Engine, it's never been easier to unlock your unbreakable creativity with Squarespace's new website designing platform. Just start with one of Squarespace's best-in-class templates that look great right out of the box. And from there, you can start customizing literally every aspect of your Squarespace site with their new optimized drag and drop technology on both desktop and mobile. There's also no limits to the number of products that you can sell using a Squarespace store, whether that's a physical good, digital good, or service products. By connecting the Square card reader to the Squarespace app, you can make sure all of your sales, orders, and inventory are up to date online and in person. So to learn more, make sure and follow my link in the description, squarespace.com/modernbuilds, where you can build out your entire Squarespace site before entering any of your credit card info. And then when it's time for your site to go live, don't forget to use my code ModernBuilds for 10% off your first site, store, or domain through Squarespace. As always, thanks to Squarespace, big thanks to you all. Now let's keep putting these floors down.
Another simple line it up, mark it, and cut it. I had this piece in the same orientation that is going to be installed when I marked these lines. In general, you don't want to install your cabinets on top of vinyl floors, and also make sure you've got that 1/4 inch gap.
And now that that cabinet is dividing the kitchen and dining room, I'm just gonna focus here in the dining room area. On Amazon, there's quite a few different styles of spacers. This one has a 1/4 inch side and a 1/2 inch side. If you're doing a whole house, you'll wanna keep your spacers in pretty much the whole time. That way it doesn't shift on you. I bought 2 30 packs of these. We'll see how they work.
I used a spacer against each one of the cabinets, and the cabinets are secured down to the subfloor, so they're not going anywhere.
If you don't have window treatments up, make sure you cover any direct light from hitting your floor during your install. Funny enough, these boxes are the perfect size to fit in my frame.
Too much heat will make your floors expand during the install, and you don't want that.
Next, I'm going to measure the gap between the walls and the floor on each side to make sure everything is running square. That's just about 5.5 to the edge of the veneer. And we're exactly 5.5 to the edge right here. That is awesome. That means from the living room to the dining room, I've kept all of this within a 64th or 32nd of an inch of square. Killer. Then I'll take a 1/4 inch from that measurement and cut my last row of planks to width on my table saw.
I pre-snapped all of these planks to length before I cut them to width on the table saw. That way this install would be super quick. And the pull bar is extra useful here, both on the ends of your planks and the edges.
Dining room, complete.
The floors are looking good, the install's going great, now let's do the kitchen.
Before we can finish out the kitchen, I need to finish out this row, and it'll be the first time that we're working from right to left instead of from left to right. I'm gonna go to the opposite end of this run and put spacers between my planks and the wall against a few rows. I don't want things to shift on me when I hit the boards in that direction. I've also got a transition piece underneath my garage door, and I wanna get that out of the way. It either needs refinished or replaced, but I do know one thing, it's gotta go for now.
Now I'll put down my next piece.
Then I'll use my straight edge referencing this plank behind it, and I'll make sure that this is tracking straight. Okay, and it needs to be right there.
This Amazon spacer paired with a wedge spacer gave me a little bit of adjustability, which is what I needed to keep this in line and tracking with the rest of the floors.
And now we'll go back working from left to right.
You guys know the drill here. I just needed to be careful not to shift this row.
One more. There we go. Perfect. And then just to make sure it's all seated, I'm not gonna hit too hard. We'll make sure we got a good seal.
I pretty much set up the camera for time-lapse mode in the rest of this kitchen area because it's a lot of the same stuff that you guys have already seen. I had to work around cabinets a little bit, but it's the same 1/4 inch spacing that I kept off of walls. So really there's nothing new to teach right here. This area where the oven will be was a good place to utilize scrap material though.
Our kitchen's done, and now we're gonna work this way down the hall. I'm excited to share the installation process here in the master bedroom because if you're doing continuous or seamless floors, this will be inevitable. I've got to install these planks backwards so they can join the rest of the floors we've already put down. A lot of people use transition strips between rooms because their house is either too large for a seamless run or they want to keep the installation process more simple. But I'll show you how to install a whole floor where instead of attaching your planks along these edges, we're doing it all backwards. First, I needed to remove these support pieces that I had screwed in and position them in the opposite doorway. That way everything is supported, along with a couple of extra support blocks. This also gave me the opportunity to use my straight edge and make sure that this run I had already placed was super straight and it just needed a little bit of adjustment. I'm really fortunate that this edge is exposed. It's going to be a lot easier to install. What I'm going to do is angle my plank so that this groove can slide underneath the board, making sure I don't damage it. But if I use my straight edge, you can see that I've got a really straight plank, and if I run this down, my distance from each wall should be the same here at the end of my straight edge and down there at the corner.
And doing this will also confirm whether your two walls are parallel or not.
My measurements are the exact same, but if I wanted to adjust anything, now would be the time. But as you can tell, I definitely don't have the 1/4 inch gap. I'm gonna grab a spacer and I'll use it along with a pencil to scribe the wall on these pieces. Then I'll cut that with a jigsaw so it's pretty much a perfect match. We can place these boards back down and we can be really confident for the rest of this room installation that we've got a reliable first run. I already used my table saw to cut a little bit of this material off, but I'm just gonna line up my next plank, making sure I close this gap and keep square before I come back with my straight edge, do a quick double check, and I can tell that's really, really close. And so we'll mark with the spacer again. And when I cut this, I don't want to take the line because that would be cutting about an extra 1/16 of an inch. That's why you see me trying to stay on the shallow side of the line.
I used the ruler as a backer and then I slid my spacer until I found the best fit.
Perfect.
While I installed the next couple of rows, I was really careful to support that first row so I didn't shift or move things. But once I got a few rows in, like I said, it really became sturdy. And FYI, the empty space that I'm leaving is for a future closet build. Typically, you want to raise the back of your plank to slide the edge underneath the previous row. But some floors want you to install the end first and then slide the edge into position. This is not as common, but make sure and read your directions before your install. These floors go down way easier by going edge first and then knocking the end with a tapping block, so that's what you'll see me do.
And for some floors, it's easier to lay out the whole row and then install it all as one piece. Especially if you've got two people, that way you can manage the row easier.
After testing this method out, I found that it was really easy to install rows backwards by putting the full row down first, because putting the ends together is kind of the difficult part. If you connect your planks into one row and then connect that long edge to your existing boards, you only need to use your tapping block once per row. And ultimately, switching operations is one of the things that takes the most time. This is also where I was thinking that having two people installing floors would be more than twice as quick because you wouldn't have to be standing up and going and grabbing planks as often. One person could be a dedicated plank grabber that always kept the installer fed with the right pattern, while the person installing the planks could just keep moving and not have to get up and down all the time. So if you're doing this project, call a friend. You'll thank me later. Once again, the pull bar is the perfect tool to finish out the last row in any room. Now check out how good this looks.
And that is how you install vinyl floors backwards.
I used the same approach in the smaller bedroom next door. These floors had to go down backwards too, but I did have a special case where I needed to backfill a closet. So in this small area, I basically installed them the right way. Then I took away this plank that I was using as my backer board, and I just finished out the rest of the room just like I did in the master. I installed these full row at a time, and I even experimented by prepping multiple rows before installing them. I'll show you some more about that in the next bedroom after I finish out this final row. Check it out.
One of the coolest things about luxury vinyl plank flooring is that it's waterproof and you can install it directly over tile in a bathroom.
The grout lines in my tile are not so dramatic that I couldn't install my floors right on top of this, but I wanted to show how people could use Henry Feather Finish to backfill any grout lines or tile that isn't flat enough to put their LVP down on top of. In this shot, you can see me using the small trowel basically like a squeegee to make sure that the concrete only backfills any low spots and doesn't create any new high points. Just like earlier, I came back with my random orbit sander with 80 grit to make sure and take care of any unsmooth sections, and then get back to flooring. And I actually had to move my door jamb to get the next piece in.
It's important you double check that everything's clean, and then we can put our pieces together. And check this out, I can now lift the back of the board and get a super tight seam. Next, I'll grab my pull bar and my mallet and knock this board in place.
In hindsight, if I made sure that there was a seam in the doorway, I could have made this work for me, but ultimately, I was able to get the same nails into the same holes of this door jamb and then secure it back in place, good as new.
And make sure you also retain an expansion gap around your vanity if you're not taking it out and reinstalling. And I'll just come back with a little bit of trim.
Laying these rows down over the tile was no problem at all. The Feather Finish did a great job of getting everything flat, and to be honest, this bathroom install was the second biggest thing I was worried about behind the transition between the living room and dining room. Even when you're not working on long runs of boards, it's important that your seams are still staggered and look natural, so always remember to be diligent. Later down the line, I'm going to build a custom little bookshelf or display for the side of this vanity, but for now I just screwed down a stop block, that way the rest of my planks aren't going to shift or move.
There's a lot of ways to work around a toilet flange. I think the easiest is just using a pencil to go around the perimeter, and that can be our template.
It's definitely not fancy, and that's pretty much the whole point. I've seen a lot of different tricks for measuring and laying this out online, but it doesn't get easier than this.
And that's a perfect fit.
I repeated these steps for each of the planks that met the toilet flange. And make sure you keep an expansion gap here because you don't want to accidentally damage the toilet flange. In tight spaces like this, it's also convenient to connect your ends together and then install the row as one piece, just like it was in the bedrooms earlier.
I hope we're square. 3 3/4 and 3 3/4. Let's go.
I made a couple of specific flooring videos in this process, including how to do the bathroom on its own. That way, if you had to do this project, you had an in-depth tutorial. I'll leave links to all that below.
We're finally down to the final bedroom, and man, it feels good to say that. Getting through this doorway shouldn't be too difficult, and I'm really thankful that there's a seam in the doorway. This allowed me to get underneath the door jamb and then use a scrap plank to make sure that I was able to lift the far side of the plank and get it underneath the existing floors. And then from each end, I was able to use the pull bar to tap that edge into place and lock everything together. Got it. After that, it's time to install the first row of planks.
I got all of my ends connected, and then I grabbed that 8-foot straight edge that I had in the last bedroom to make sure that everything was lined up.
I really like this method of laying out a chunk of floors, prepping everything to make sure that you don't have any overlap or repeating patterns. And overall, it just lets me change operations less. While I'm running back and forth, switching in and out new pieces, I can do a lot of that. And then when it's time to lay out my rows and install them, I can stay focused on that task. The whole time though, I'm making sure that everything locks together the way that I want, and I'm using my tapping block along the edge pieces and the end of each row.
As I approached the end of the row, it looked like the distance from the edge of my floor and the wall was consistent, but I made sure to get my tape measure out and double check.
5.5. Wow, 5.5, perfect.
Honestly, I cannot believe how often I got these perfect measurements between the existing floors and the walls. I really did my best to lay everything out and start each row the best that I could, but I was still flabbergasted to find out that everything was just square and true. It was super awesome. Now we're really close to our floors being done. We've just got a couple of things to take care of. One, we've got a little bit of room in this closet that we need to backfill. This will just take a couple of seconds and utilize some scrap material.
Now I'm gonna go ahead and get this mess cleaned up.
The boxes went to recycling, and check out how little waste I had.
I seriously tried to use as many scrap pieces as I could, and these are all the planks that I have left over with joining ends. So overall, very little wasted material. And then after that, I'll remove all of my spacers, making sure that I don't have any gaps or spaces in between any of my planks. While you're working around the house, it might shift a board here or there, so go back with your pull bar and knock any rows or planks that have shifted back into alignment.
And if you've got any floors that have shifted and you can't get the pull bar between the plank and the wall, just use a little bit of painter's tape and hot glue to connect a 2x4 piece of wood to create your own tapping block that can get the board off of the wall. The hot glue is enough to keep the 2x4 from moving, but it's easy enough to remove by hitting on the edge. This is also an easy fix for floors if you've already got trimmed down. So really quick, let's go to before we put down any new floors. This house was completely mismatched with stained hardwoods, tile in the bathroom that needed replaced, and subfloor with underlayment specific to LVP. But now it looks so great. It's awesome having no unfinished surfaces. The ceilings, the walls, and now the floors are complete, and I'm really happy that they're luxury vinyl plank. I'm really proud that I took the extra time and did the work to create a seamless, transition-free installation throughout this whole house. It wasn't easy, but worth it. Let me know what you think down in the comments.
I really hope you enjoyed today's episode. Make sure and like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Mike's First Flip. Bye, everybody.
It's Mike's First Flip.